I think the conversation that we started this morning was about the embrace of data. Whether we realize it or not, it was kind of the consequence of where 5G networks are heading, where 4G networks are heading. And what we've discovered and we understand now is that in thinking about 5G, we have to think about how big data is going to play into all this. John, to your point, your last part of your presentation was talking about the social contextual issues, data being both sensitive and private, but also to the point that it has a bearing on everything from the quantified self to how do people relate to their device, how do they relate to their overall social ecosystem. We're going to continue this conversation a little bit now and talk about how operators can get a little bit more tactical and how they can think about their strategy. Joining me today on the panel, Soma is going to give us a little bit of representation, I think, from a technology angle of how that really factors in. And John, I'm interested in how you weigh into what it is that we're seeing from not only the research, but really the pragmatism of what we need to do in terms of getting ourselves oriented. I think it's really an orientation question, right, as we start to move into the next decade around mobility. So let's start with thinking about strategy here for a second. 5G mobile networks, there's no curiosity the fact that we're going towards, the mobile consumer and the intelligence that we gain from the mobile consumer. What should operators do to best prepare themselves in terms of the expectations? Your last point about sort of that unfolding event of an elderly patient sitting in a doctor's office and then suddenly unveiling her whole life before her was sort of a crescendo, if you will. But what can operators do in terms of preparing to get that customer intelligence and making it a strategic asset? I think personally that data is going to become a strategic asset to most operators, and they haven't realized that just yet. So, John, why don't you lead us with that? How would you respond?
Well, it's a really good question because I think it's clear that this is an environment where a very large amount of data will be produced and collected, and data, I think, and I like the very careful wording of consumer intelligence. It's not just data, but it's data within its context and its meaning, and trying to really sharpen our ability to be able to do that. We touched on it some with the great question about location as a context, and as you all know, that really helps to shape our knowledge, turn data into knowledge, and so forth. But there's other issues too in terms of time and what we're thinking and so forth, and our own local knowledge and understanding that can also be captured as well. So so I think there's more that's going to happen here. I know that oftentimes operators will desire to collect this information to understand how this relates to the performance of the network. But I think increasingly as we go into the future, operators are also going to be in that space where not only they can care about the performance of the network, but they're also going to be, expanding their connections into devices and consumer behavior as well. I think we're going to see less silos, more sort of these convergence of mashups of things. It's kind of like the reverse model of Apple in a way where now it has become you sort of see a mashup in all these different things as well. And so I think that's also going to be driving the data. And so I think it means bringing in different types of people to complement the engineers and the specialists that are there that have an understanding of both the technology and the people. We talk about in the academic side of these engineering programs for humanity that are sensitive to that interaction between people and the use of technology. And I think with those types of skills, I think then you can really, leverage the data that's there to really drive the intelligence that's out. But if it's truly just in terms of think about the network, you're not going to be able to. But if you really think about how to meet those individual needs, you're going to have to, grab some extra data to really understand new models and approaches for doing it.
Yeah. Well, so we're heading towards this openness, but synchronization, right? We're synchronizing across so many different sources. And I think that's really the power of big data is taking all this disparate data that's connected in wide arrays of different contexts and so on, bringing it together in some more crucible points that matter, right? That drive an impact in people's lives. So how does this take shape now when you start to think about the operator's paradigm and where they're going to move towards building the network that's going to serve that purpose?
Yeah. First of all, I'm very glad that in the room and many speakers in the audience, we've started to talk about 5G is not just about speed. I think we've gone past the stage. We will hit the limits of physics. We will have obviously exploit it, but it's beyond that. It's how do you contextualize the data and personalize the network experience. I'm from Singapore, and Singapore Airlines doesn't go out and just build more airlines. Right? I mean, obviously they put more planes on the air, but the way they make money is personalize that whole experience. Four Seasons makes 5 times more money. They don't have 5 times bigger rooms, right? It's about the personalization of the experience. So there are two things that operators are working on, and vendors follow that, or we kind of work together. In terms of contextualizing this information, personalizing and using it, one is for the quality of experience, as in managing that network. For example, if Scott is in the network, how do I understand where he is? What's the best base stations to serve him? And how can I improve his experience? So it's very much about personalization, but on the network experience perspective. The other one is going to be around lifestyle, because I also happen to know a lot of information on the lifestyle of. I know
Consequential or inconsequential.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Just as a matter of existing, right? It's coexistence within the network.
Right.
Right.
Now, I'm always a little, I guess I'm a little upset with the industry a bit, because if you look at Google, they are able to monetize that personal information. Look at Yahoo or the internet. But because of the way that telecom operators have been governed, it's not possible to actually monetize the data. So hopefully, as we move to the 5G, I understand privacy issues, but I think telecom operators need to be given a better level playing field in order to leverage that personal information that's available to them. Because if Google can do it, I don't know why, or Sprint can't do a bit better. I think there's governance issue that needs to be addressed. So in summary, two things. I think contextualizing the information for network experience, and contextualizing it for the lifestyle changes that can apply to that. So we work on both of these technologies, but the data is available. How we use it.
Well, there's no dispute that the data is going to continue to be more and more readily available. It's how we're going to manage that with fairness, equality, and the balance, right? Balancing privacy and the behavior of consumers that want so much, but will give so much, to respect those boundaries. So the infrastructure has to mirror some of the contextual relevance that they're going to see.
Right.
Let's think about another aspect for a second. Let's talk about how are operators going to be immensely successful doing this, right? The economics of what they were dealt in 4G was very expensive. The 4G network and the build out and what they learned through backhaul and issues of providing that quality of experience proved to say that they need to rethink how they're going to do business going forward. But what sort of lessons, what sort of those points can they take away in terms of taking the next step and being prepared that they don't make the same mistakes twice? So how would you deal with that?
Yeah, this big data it's very big, right? And it's
How big is it? Because it's always interesting. I get asked I'm an economist, and so my first question someone asked me says, well, how big is big data? I said, well, we're small data, medium data, and maybe we'll have extra large data, but big data is big. But how big is it in terms of the operator world?
So I'll draw one parallel on this one. If you look at 2G, the number of devices we had in 2G, and the number of sessions we would initiate from a 2G call or 2G phone, is maybe like 10 sessions a day or 20 sessions a day. But if you look at what's happening with our smartphone today, you're talking about hundreds of sessions, if not thousands of sessions. And the number of devices are also exponentially high. So if you multiply the number of devices and the number of sessions per device, it's huge. It's probably in the quantum of 10,000 times more than what we generate in 3G. And big data it's not easy. There's one science of let's give me all the data you have, let's put it on a platform, let's figure out what to do with it. And that's not easy in data science. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Right.
If you end up storing all the data, you might realize it's useless after all. Right. So sometimes you need to be able to process and store. Sometimes you need to store and process. I think both these techniques are starting to emerge in data science. And most importantly, it's operators need to understand what do they really want to do with the data, and build an analytics platform and big data platform that kind of works in that favor, rather than just jumping on the back. In the 90s, everybody built a data warehouse. You all know, huge amounts of money was spent in that. Where is that? We were supposed to have all the data. So
They're still searching.
exactly. So it's not just about collecting the data and storing it, but it's also the ability to act on that data. And that becomes, especially in telecom, because speed and location and context is very real time. I'm talking about less than a minute, less than 5 minutes. So from a big data perspective, it's very important to think about platforms that can absorb a huge amount of data and maybe even discard the data after that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So how do we get from insight to execution? In my practice, I work with a lot of our clients, giving them the advisory work of taking those insights to operationalization, trying to get them to further their actual influence on the organization, make that bottom line impact, because to your point, there's a lot of data that's stored, not a lot of it's very useful. And so how do you start to cull that and take what's necessary and curate the insights and then apply them to the organization? That's a real big problem. John, I mean, how do you think about this in the context of making performance impact to an organization? How do you think about giving them that sort of multidimensionality of the data that's going to give them some results?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Another part of my research has really focused on the performance aspect of things, and so from some early lessons learned in that work, I really think there's several things that they can do. The first thing is, oftentimes organizations make a mistake where they will latch on to an innovation. Like big data is something that's very easy to say, hey, we're doing it. But oftentimes that's done in isolation from what they are trying to do, or they'll do it in a piecemeal fashion. So they say we're doing big data and we're doing these deep data analytics and so forth, but it's not really a central part of the organization. So I think taking more of a strategic perspective will really drive performance. So it includes, things we talked about earlier is not only having the right people, but empowering people to actually use that information to make decisions that make a difference. And then giving them not only the authority to be able to do it, but the skills and know-how of how to do that. Secondly, being able to have the ability to work across the organization with multidisciplinary teams to try and figure out how do we really leverage this and so forth, and really giving them the skills, the resources, the know-how, the space, the time, the rewards to be able to do that type of thing. Thirdly, I see a lot of organizations that really push to be high performing by also looking at sort of a couple different models of leadership to really make this happen, because it takes two sorts of models. You need sort of that top-down leadership where there is a vision within a company that's shared very broadly. So as you're looking at these different analytics and data and so forth, that you're making sure that your decisions align with whatever that vision is, and there's a good shared understanding of that vision all across the organization. But secondly, there's so much knowledge that's embedded on folks that are doing things from day to day, and organizations that unleash that knowledge and that talent and that skill, with models of emergent leadership, are ones that also perform very well as too. So when you're going to be, with the data analytics in this particular case, you're going to be down in the trenches thinking about things, and you've got to somehow tap into the insights of the folks that are working on the front lines, sharing that, finding what's really works well for the company, what aligns well, what could really make a big difference, and really trying to leverage that as well. And really trying to drive down the cost of sort of this type of innovation, I think, is important. And we see companies trying to do it with various tools, some that work well and some that don't. I'm kind of smiling because we see a lot of use of knowledge management tools as that buzzword of what's going to really work.
That was from the 90s too.
That's from the 90s as well, and it gets warmed over a little bit now. But the idea is that, are there ways of tapping into the social network and social intelligence of your organization? It can make a big difference.
So the second part to this question is, I think, and I'm going to give you kind of a visionary posit, if I will. I think that operators can become the intermediary for data and insights that we never saw before, because not just the contextual relevance and bearing to people in their lives, but because of the fact that what leads to their performance, their own market improvement, will be because of the construct of data network. Do you agree?
Yeah, because when someone was answering the question earlier, that's why I was thinking that this could be the perfect place because they are collecting this information. They do have the ability to collect it very cheaply and easily in a contextualized way. And so, I strongly agree with that because somebody's got to play that role. And frankly, the operators are at the front line of collecting this data as well. I mean, because it's all coming through their organization. I think that's why we're seeing, these examples of companies like the Google Fiber project, for example, right? Their project wasn't simply about putting fiber in the ground. It was really getting to the place where you've got fiber in the ground plus wireless, and along with user data and combining all that. And that's their role. They are a data intermediary. They're using it internally for their company. But the providers, operators could also, play that role because they own the network. They're at the key points of the network. They can grab this data, and so they have the data. So I certainly could see that, especially when they connect in different vertical areas as well. Healthcare, manufacturing, and so.
Let's move that conversation a little further. We've talked a lot about the Internet of Things. We've talked about machine to machine. We've talked about sensors that we walk throughout the city and they collect data on us, and we're kind of passing through this sort of digital journey, if you will, through our daily lives. No way that we ever see that 10 years ago, and certainly not 20 years ago. So when you think about the Internet of Things and you think about the implication upon mobile networks, what can you do that delivers real innovation? Soma, if you were sitting down in front of your clients and so on and telling them that innovation is going to come from the network, what would be the message around IoT that you would deliver?
Great question, actually. So, one, I think the gentleman earlier talked about wearable, right? So one of the things that's happening is there's a lot of personalized data, and that can be used and analyzed, and they call it coaching. You can coach that person back. As I'm running fast or running slow and I'm having injuries or something, if this information can be analyzed by
real time and the feedback, right?
And the feedback is, start making smaller strides, or start running faster, or things like that, pace yourself. So there can be a lot of intimate coaching that can happen, feedback system. I think that's one. And then there's two areas that they're looking at Internet of Things. The biggest two areas. One is home networking, where you have an intelligent home. And the second is really wearables, which actually change the life of the people, right? And that, in fact, there's a sensor that's 20 cents, I think. You can actually ingest,
right?
You can actually eat that sensor. And when you eat that sensor, that's on a tablet. It makes sure that the patients are eating the tablets at the right time. And they've done what they have to do. And, old people, maybe in the 70s or 80s, they might forget eating the medicine.
Right.
And, if that's not taken at the right time, the nurse can call and say, have you taken your medicine? It seems like you forgot. So a lot of personal feedback and coaching. I guess you can look at it in two ways. One is privacy, because somebody is looking at your personal data. But at the same time, all of us want to have a better lifestyle, and we want to be, helped along the way. I think that's the biggest thing. Internet of Things is about how to improve ourselves and excel personally. We can all do that by more information.
So it sounds like the application of the networks themselves, the applications being the connected car, the connected home, the connected self, the connected world, suddenly becomes that closed 360 sort of feedback that we may want or appreciate and may be willing to pay for.
Right.
John, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree on one hand, but I also want to raise some red flags on another. And it's kind of based on the question from the previous session when she brought up about privacy as well. So, we've seen some other experiments that are related that can help us to understand sort of the human response to this type of interconnection and interoperability. So a few years ago, it did a study for the OECD looking at identity management. And so this was to look at identity management in, across the world. And the thing that I was really surprised by in terms of reaction was the stories of rolling out identity management in different countries and hearing the response from the public. And the response I would imagine would be very similar because I see so many similarities. So you had instances in countries where were trying to go to a single identity management system that was being tied to your driver's license or your passport type of thing. And really great ideas on paper and concept. You could see the benefits and so forth. But they were flatly rejected because of people's fear of, here's a single point of information about all these important parts of my life that are available to an institution or institutions that I don't have a lot of control over. So in this case, a lot of examples were coming out of the EU with different stories out of the UK and some Scandinavian countries, where the next step was to combine it and try and make a federated, identity management system that could be shared across the entire EU. And it just failed miserably because of the reaction of people being just very fearful about having that much information about your personal life in one place as well. So I think those are lessons that can really limit how the extent to which these ideas of an Internet of Things can really happen as well. Because if you think about transferring this, generalizing to your home being connected and so forth, I just would love to understand.
Avoid the creepy factor.
Yeah. How do people feel about it? When I'm in my car, I just want to be in my car. My car is more than just driving. My car is a sense of freedom for me. And my wife's got this new car and it's like infinitely connected and knows all this stuff about us, and it just drives me off the wall because I just want to drive. And I don't need to tell me if my gas mileage is good or there's a sale at Starbucks. I don't need that to pop up on our screen, or a storm is coming and so forth. I just want
or the bridge is out.
Yeah, the bridge is out. I want that freedom of that experience myself. And so this whole notion of control over this Internet of Things, I think, is going to be very important. There's times where you want it. There's times where you just don't.
So there has to be some sort of learning, some sort of neural learning about the individual, back to personalization, back to the things we've talked about already, that connect that individual to the level of relinquishing control, giving them some sort of autonomy to do what they want to do, and then being able to still operate, be productive, and enjoy what they're doing, whether it's driving a car, riding a bicycle, or so on.
Yeah, but the flip side of where it could be really helpful, if you take a car example, I do appreciate the telemetrics in a car for helping the manufacturers know how to produce better parts and know when parts are going to fail and try to extend life, things like that. Or it's used to have more information about the life cycle of your consumer devices in your house, your refrigerators, washing machines, and those types of things, to help you to be more proactive in taking care of things. I can see great benefit in those sorts of uses. That do make sense. It's a tough question.
Yeah, it's a balance. So let's put an envelope around a lot of this. We've talked a lot about big data. We've talked a lot about what's happening today that didn't happen 5 years ago, and probably what's going to happen in the next 5 years. We're talking about 5G networks, right? So we're thinking futuristically. But what has to come down to the decisions being made is sort of the rubric of how do you score and evaluate what's going to make money? How do you use big data to drive economic performance, whether it's producing more revenue to an organization, or it's maybe minimizing cost, or maybe it's taking some adjacency in terms of what the performance is? How do you really do that? Soma, where would you go in terms of advising someone on big data to get the economics and the potential from it?
Yeah, there's one saying that you don't have control in life, you only have a choice to react. And big data is something like that. Everybody thinks that by having a lot of data, you're going to have control over the others. But it's really a choice to react. If we know the right things at the right time, we have a choice to react, we can really make some smart decisions. So, again, impulsively, I would say the economics here is ability to understand the context of the call and react at that time instantaneously. And we don't know many of the applications. We really don't know what's going to happen. I work a lot with Google, and if you look at some of the things that Google does, many times they didn't know what they were going to do. Google Map, for example, they just exposed the API. They actually didn't know what to do with it. And what happened was applications came later. People started putting a lot of ads on it. They started posting their businesses, and then it started thriving. what we can do is we can actually enable this platform and data, expose this data, and hopefully, people will learn how to use it with what do you call it, with the right governance,
Mhm.
and start monetizing it. So if there's one answer to what can I do with the data, I'm not sure I can do that. Um, but in saying that, that typically what corporations do is there are two things, right? One is driving efficiency,
Mhm.
and second is creating value. So the value creation part is always a bit iffy. It's all, everybody talks about it, but it's very difficult,
Very undefined,
very
oftentimes, right?
undefined, and it's very gray.
Mhm.
But the efficiency driving can be done much more concrete. So definitely big data, we can prove the business case by driving some efficiencies now
Mhm.
and prepare for the future, which we really don't know what it is.
Mm.
Right? That's how I.
Let me ask you this: why are people so intrigued by big data?
Actually,
Why are they enamored? Why is there this whole new vogue thing of big data? Why is that, from your perspective?
as John pointed out earlier, I think one is we forget that there's a lot of things that's happened before we arrived at this point. One is digitization, right? So information that was in very different, disparate places, all of a sudden are coming together in one small device. It's not about having a lot of data. It's about having a lot of different data. When you put it together, means something else.
Mm-hmm.
And one example I would give you is, we started um, one of machine learning programs, and we ran information like what's the birth rate in the US, when was the power outages,
Mm-hmm.
what's the AIDS in Africa, or things like that. Very random set of data. And then interestingly, we discovered that 10 months after a major power outage in the US, the US birth rate actually jumped.
The
Something
moral of
that
the story is power outages create gestation and birth. Okay.
it's
Okay.
something that we would not, it's three different data, it always existed,
Mm-hmm.
but we never looked at it that way, putting things together and contextualizing in a whole different meaning, and creating a whole different meaning out of it. I think that's what big data intrigues people, because it creates a lot of information about a lot of different things. And when you put it together, it could mean something else. So that's at least my.
Interesting, John. To the counter of this, I mean, we're dealing with more and more data today. As I tell people, that we're awash with data. What's new about analytics is the fact we got more data that's sufficient to help us answer some questions. We have more advancements in terms of power and computing and scalability to actually drive insights from that data. But at the end of the day, we're still having to deal with the human factor of how do we do something with the data that becomes meaningful? How do you take that to the next level?
I think it's a really good question. It's big data, but it's also right data as well too. You, Frank, especially with an analytical, econometric background and forecasting and so forth, we know that these models may not necessarily be the right data as well. We may have a lot of the data, but is it the right data for what we're trying to do? And I think that's the tricky part. We've been, doing this analytical stuff for quite a long time. I remember doing work on policing and trying to predict crime hotspots, or work with the Veterans Administration, trying to pick up or develop models that were better at picking up causality between treatments and things like that. But when you look at sort of the predictive power of these models, they're relatively low. I remember the early days of models of trying to figure out how do we anticipate or predict the right type of ad to send somebody, using data mining and so forth. And it was better than regression techniques were many of the methods, but they still weren't really strong. So there's a real big problem trying to figure it out. I think part of it is getting the right data with the large amount of data as well too. There's never, and I think one reason for why folks are intrigued with it is the possibility that I could use it in a way to substitute human decision making, which could be a model for helping to drive down costs in a large organization. If I've got some kind of computer control with data that is guiding a person that I'm paying $40 an hour, maybe if that model is really good, we get good work practices go with it, I can now pay that person $15 an hour, right? And so there's this capital labor substitution that's at the heart of these issues around this as well too. I think that when you look at these types of things, that humans never going to be lost. I think it's going to help us make better decisions and so forth. I think that the decision maker will have greater insight, be able to do things a little bit more quickly and things like that. but I think the challenge is going to be how do we sort of use this data consistently throughout the organization in order to make a difference. A lot of examples of this data analytics tend to focus on a small group of people, but if we can get greater consistency across the organization, maybe that'll improve quality and things like that as well. But I think there's, again, what's the value of this? Where's the company trying to go forward? How are they trying to leverage it? What are they trying to do? Things like that I think are things that have to be sorted out, because it can be used for good and it can also be used in bad ways.
When I'm teaching courses, whether it's econometrics or microecon, especially when you get down to segmentation, I always teach students have to look at the data and be very familiar with the data. There's all that social intimacy. I think if you remove this sort of intimacy with the data, you no longer have that contextual balance to actually do something that's very purposeful. So hopefully the world doesn't become taken over by algorithms only and by bots and so on that just drive the answers and say, here's what you need to know, because it could be errant or it could have bias that we're not looking to inject into that model, right? So I think that's important to think through. Let's close our time together today and kind of, we're prognosticating for a bit now about what's going to happen in the next 5 years. But if you had to think down the road, when you think about decision science, and you think about advanced analytics and thinking predictively, what's the single best contribution that this will make, and how will 5G networks play a bearing to that? Soma, how does that really align with the future in terms of operator strategy?
As I said, two things. One is making networks smarter. So, sometimes utilization is not 90%, but, operators have to spend a lot of money in the infrastructure to lay that. So just making networks much smarter in decision making and much more efficient. That's clearly a benefit, an economic benefit to that. Mm-hmm. The second part of this is using this data and personalizing for the consumer. I think these are the two big things we have. And the most important thing that we need to make sure happens in 5G is that 5G is built for data mining and personalization. Mm-hmm. It should not be an afterthought. It should be designed for that. And information should be readily available. And if possible, it should also be some kind of segmented so that everybody can use it smarter. Today, the problem with telecom data, the biggest challenge with telecom data is highly formatted. If you don't know what you're looking for, you won't find it, right? It's highly formatted. There's a lot of mediation that needs to happen before you can actually understand this data. So we need to make this data readable, computable, mm-hmm. and generally computable so that it can be used.
So it can be actionable.
Actionable. And,
right.
And again, coming back to actions, yeah, exactly. So your question, what's the what's the biggest thing? I think one is making networks smarter, mm-hmm. therefore bringing the cost down, mm-hmm. and generally, much pleasant experience for the consumer.
Mm. So moving from the novel idea and the after construction to the sort of foreground of saying this is innovation we can drive.
Yes.
Interesting. John, to kind of close a thought on that, I mean, how do we really use that science into its fullest advantage? I mean, we're just on the cusp of trying to do some, I think, pretty interesting things. And I think that's why people are really excited about analytics. But what do we do to shift this into second gear and so on?
Yeah, well, I would like to build on that. I agree strongly about the smarter networks, and I've illustrated in a couple of different ways as well. The thing about I think is very intriguing about some of the concepts or ideas that folks are talking about with 5G is the fact that we need a network that's very robust to provide reliable, high-speed, high bandwidth, low latency connectivity, and we need to know where that is. So the smart networks make great sense. The data analytics can help us estimate the demand on the network around different events and so forth. So I think that's certainly a very large area where I think it would make a difference. I think there's a value. Secondly, I think there's a value added that if the operators can connect with different verticals, like in healthcare or manufacturing and so forth, and find, as you said, segment their strategies for making smart networks to really match the very specific needs within these niches. I think that's the other place that we can expect to happen. As an example, I think of healthcare, and it's very common to talk about using it for sharing X-rays or MRIs and that type of thing. And I know the one thing that we're looking at with our software-defined networks that the 10 cities test bed we're talking about is how do you make special lanes in the internet for very critical things like that. So if there all of a sudden there's a high priority MRI that absolutely has to get through, how do we do that? If a certain set, if some of these teleimmersion healthcare provision services will ask you to take a photo of the mole or the scratch or the bump or whatever, and you want to upload that like right now today because it's very high priority. So I could see a value added of the operators working with the different inside the different segments and verticals to further add value to what those verticals need and trying to customize and really specialize the network as well. And I think the data analytics could really help understand that demand and could be conditioned based on the needs within those different verticals.